Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to another Hearthstone deck guide. I'm JoRoSaR, your host for this video, and today we're going to be looking at a little bit of Shaman. Now, in the Old Gods meta, Shaman's considered a top tier class to the point where it basically starts getting auto-banned in tournaments. Shaman currently possesses both board development mechanics and tons of damage, and it's one of the two primary specifications for this class that we're going to be looking at today. It is the Face Aggro Shaman, the destroyer of calm moods on the ladder, as well as a fantastic deck, so good that it basically gets banned in tournament play. So let's take a look first at our general strategy and our key cards. As the name suggests, Aggro Shaman's all about killing your opponents quickly and mercilessly. If you like, they're arguably the new Hunter. This is done mainly through two mechanics: mighty and cheap minions, which are onboard threats to everything else your opponent has to offer, as well as burst damage, which can just reach for the final couple of points of life that you want to steal away from your opponent to close the game off before it gets to the late game. And by far, the two most important early game cards for Aggro Shaman are the Tunnel Trogg and Totem Golem. These cards are absolutely pivotal to you being able to kill your opponents in the early game, and they're also massive threats that your opponents have to deal with quickly or risk suffering catastrophic losses. So I'm going to talk to you about these cards a little bit more on the coming slides, if you will. But first, I want to talk about counters, or specifically the lack thereof for Totem Golem. At a 3/4, on its body, Totem Golem is just outside the reach of most early game removal. So you look at cards like Wrath, Quick Shot, Fiery Winaxe. Cards like this don't actually kill it off in one turn. So your opponent will either need to draw a hard removal, like Shadow Word Pain or Execute, or he or she will need to consume multiple cards and more mana than optimal to get rid of your Totem Golem. It's a fantastic card and really, really difficult to counter. Totem Golem was released with the Grand Tournament and was predicted to be an auto-include the minute Shaman got a few more pieces of early game into their deck choices. And conveniently, that time is now. So let's take a look at the Tunnel Trogg for starters. The Tunnel Trogg came from League of Explorers, essentially becoming what Mana Worm is for Tempo Mages. And Tunnel Trogg can often carry the game by itself, because the tools that Shaman has to protect him, such as cheap removals and Feral Spirit, are beautiful as far as this card's synergies are concerned. You can basically have two taunts on the board with Feral Spirit, for example, while boosting your Tunnel Trogg and putting bodies in the way of your opponent being able to kill it off. It makes it an extremely reliable early game board presence and forces your opponent to use a lot of hard removals to try and deal with it. Aggro Shaman relies heavily on getting an explosive start though, so it's not all good news, so mulliganing for both Tunnel Trogg and Totem Golem is more or less absolutely required. And with both cards in hand, the Aggro Shaman can put 5 attack and 7 life worth of stats onto the board by turn 2, spread between two bodies. That's pretty good. And this makes clearing the board extremely problematic and can escalate into a snowball effect very early on in the game. And that's one of the biggest reasons why Aggro Shaman is such a powerful deck. So let's take a look a little bit at other options we have in the early game as well. So as I mentioned, Aggro Shaman's very heavily reliant on early board presence, and it can lose games if it doesn't exert enough pressure early on, and that gives your opponents time to catch up, time to draw removals, time to heal themselves, or build bigger boards themselves. Luckily, in most Aggro Shaman decks, there are about 12 1 and 2 mana cost combat minions, which allows for a decent, if not ideal, start in each game. So Tunnel Trogg and Totem Golem are already mentioned as the MVPs, but if you don't get them, there's still a couple of cards that are useful for you to remember. So Finley Murgleton is the first one. He replaces your rather useless hero power at this stage of the game with a better one, so you hope to get an offensive one, obviously, like Steady Shot, damage on demand, Shapeshift, 3 attack Doomhanger swings are very, very useful, and Life Tap, of course, for additional card draw, which is needed for a deck that runs out of cards, or Fire Blast, because a ping is a ping is a ping, and it's always good. Argent Squire is another card you can consider. The Divine Shield can combine with Abusive Sergeant, Rockbiter Weapon, Flame Tongue Totem, and make for favourable trade-ups. And you've also got the Eternal Sentinel. Now, the Eternal Sentinel is not only a 3/2 body, but it unlocks mana crystals from Overload. So because sometimes you just need that 1 mana for Lightning Bolt after you've played Totem Golem, or you want to get back the 2 mana Overload from Feral Spirit so you can play a minion, draw cards, or do whatever you want with the rest of your mana, it's very useful to have Eternal Sentinel. In some deck variations, any number of Eternal Sentinels can be replaced with Lava Shock. Lava Shock does basically the same thing, but it sacrifices the body, having a 3/2 on the board, for 2 immediate damage. So you pays your money and you makes your choice, basically. It's kind of up to you. So let's take a look at some of the spells we're likely to be using in the game as well. They're all relatively cheap, as you can tell. Shaman has a range of cheap removal spells. Use them to protect your board or clear the way for destroying your opponent's face. Rockbiter Weapon is a very flexible card that can be attached to a minion like Abusive Sergeant for trading up. You can activate a 0/2 Taunt Golem, for instance, or you can turn a Doom Hammer into a 10 damage swing, my personal favorite, or 16 damage swing if you have 2 of them in your hand, where hey. Earthshock. Not universally included in decks, admittedly, and it comes and goes with the meta, but it's basically the deck's anti-taunt card. And then Lightning Bolt is just 1 mana 3 damage. It goes anywhere. I mean, what more do you need? Maybe a Lava Burst or to create damage out of thin air. Why not? It's just a fantastic card. So going into the mid-game, we have these spells, we have these MVP cheap minions, we also have the supporting cast of 1 and 2 drops that we can use to bolster our early game. What happens once we need to keep the momentum going? So Aggro Shaman isn't all about having 1 mana minions that can chip away at life totals, although that's good. The deck has multiple tools to keep the damage train going and going and going and never letting go of the pressure. And one of the most important cards to consider here is the Tuskar Totemic. So you can see him up here and everything that he can summon over here. Tuskar Totemic is a 3 mana drop and is considered to be one of the absolute best cards in the game at the moment. It will often decide games on arrival if he pulls a good totem. And if you think the chances of that are low, think again. There are 7 totems in total that you can see on the screen now. 4 that come from your hero power, and 3 really good ones. Totem Golem, Flame Tongue Totem, or the Mana Tide Totem. This means that 1 in 3 times, you'll get something that's just too awesome. That's not bad as far as odds are concerned. I'm pretty sure it's actually slightly higher than 1 in 3 as well. And this means that around 14% of the time, you'll have a 3/2 and a 3/4 for 3 mana. Now that's not bad at all, is it? So even though there's a little bit of RNG involved, generally speaking, it's just a fantastic card and you're going to be using it to really ride the mid-game through and continue pushing the momentum through to your opponent. There are, of course, other cards we can be playing in the mid-game, and some newer cards that have actually made it comfortably into the deck and have really made Aggro Shaman super strong. Feral Spirit, though, it's not a new card, it's an old Shaman goodie that came back into rotation as a boost and protection tool for Tunnel Trogg. Trogg into coin into Feral Spirit, for example, is a really powerful opening play that puts 7 attack and 9 health worth of stats on 3 bodies at once. Very, very powerful. Feral Spirit's overload drawback as well can now be cured with Lava Shock or Eternal Sentinel, which makes it more effective. Flame Wreathed Faceless is Shaman's most highly valued card from the Whispers of the Old Gods expansion. It shines in a meta that doesn't include Big Game Hunter anymore, and it basically only dies to hard removal or multiple minion trades that early in the game, because you are going to be playing it quite early on. It's fantastic. Doomhammer, as we mentioned before, represents 10 or potentially 16 damage in a single turn, and it represents on its own 16 damage spread over multiple turns. It's a reliable source of repetitive pressure. The damage can either go face or to control the enemy board at the cost of life. And you don't mind this because you always have more life than your opponent if you're playing this deck right. The mere presence of Doomhammer is threatening because a Rockbiter draw is a 10 damage burst, and as I mentioned before, a double Rockbiter draw, my favorite way to end the game, is a 16 damage burst. So these are all the different kind of cards that go into the thinking behind an Aggro Shaman deck, so hopefully now you have a better idea of what cards are in the decks and why. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the more interesting tech choices. The difference between different Aggro Shaman builds are kind of subtle and mostly depend on personal preference and the state of the meta, to be honest. The most common differences are a yes or no on whether we include Tuskar Totemic, how many ancestral knowledges we have in the deck, whether we go with Earthshock or not, that tends to be a yes or no decision, how many flame jugglers we have, and stuff like that. More specific tech choices, which aren't too uncommon to the tournament meta, are the inclusion of Acidic Swamp Ooze, for instance, to deal with weapon wielders, and Leroy Jenkins, which became really popular during the Hearthstone North American prelims for HCT. And this, of course, gives the deck just a little bit of extra burst. So finally, we're going to take a look a little bit at a number of deck lists that you can consider using when you build your own face Shaman deck as well. So you can go ahead if you want and pause the video at this point and take a look at the lists next to me. You can do that in full screen and just save it as an image if you want, or just go ahead and build them while the video is paused. But basically, number one is your standard Aggro Shaman deck list. It more or less has everything a face Shaman needs. The one in the middle is quite interesting. It's the Elemental Destruction version. And some Shaman players choose to use this tech to counter mid-range boards when they face things like Zoo, or mid-range Shaman, or even play the mirror matchup. Because this card is cheap, it also allows for board clear and additional board development, and it basically steals back the tempo from your opponent. And finally, the third, and in my opinion quite fun in Whispers of the Old God, we have the Thing from Below version of the deck. Now, an Aggro Shaman doesn't need to play quite as many totems as mid-range, so that does mean that this card isn't an auto-include, but it's a tech that a lot of North American players really like. A simple Totem Golem and Tuskar Totemic, for example, in a game, can immediately reduce this to be a 4-mana 5/5, which is already fantastic value. And it will only grow cheaper as the game progresses. So I actually quite like being able to use this card a little bit later on, and just to give your mid-game a little bit of the extra oomph in order to kill off your opponents quickly if they're being particularly stubborn. So that is your basic guide to a face Aggro Shaman now that Whispers of the Old Gods have been released. I hope you've enjoyed this. Make sure you go ahead and like the video and subscribe to GoSu Hearthstone as well, and there will be more deck guides from me in the near future. Make sure you follow me as well on Facebook and Twitter, and when I next release a guide, I will be letting you guys know there. Until then, though, enjoy laddering up and take care. Bye.